Thanks, Maggie and DataHub team for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I will just dive right in here. Agenda, a little bit about Jumio, sort of the obligatory kind of thing, and then get into mostly why are we using DataHub, how we're using it, and some of the adoption and future state kind of discussion. So briefly about me, I've been at Jumio just about 2 years. It'll be 2 years in May, but been doing this quite a while, about 30 years, more than 30 years as a professional engineer, mostly doing back-end stuff and enterprise software. And I've done everything from, a handful of individuals at a startup to multinationals like HP with hundreds of thousands of people. And for those of you who know University of California, Santa Cruz, I'm a banana slug, and my degree is in computer science. So most of what I've been doing in my career, as it turns out, has to do with fraud prevention, and that's no different at Jumio. What we do is fraud and compliance, things like anti-money laundering across the life cycle. And it's extremely important to obviously do fraud prevention, but you also want to try and do that with a good user experience, particularly on the onboarding side of things, because conversion is important. But there's been a lot of stuff in the news about fake accounts and all these kinds of things. You don't want bad actors getting into your system as well. And so to do so, obviously it's pretty complex, and there's a lot of different checks that you can do and a lot of different data sources out there. Each one of these different kinds of sources actually could be a separate company. Some do multiple, provide multiple of these databases at the same, from the same company, but a lot of these are different, or you can have different vendors of the same thing. So trying to stitch this all together, obviously yourself, to do onboarding is and fraud prevention is expensive, costly, a lot of different problems that you could have there. And of course, that's where Jumio comes in. And we have our no-code orchestration platform that pulls together all of these data sources and includes that with our own AI and machine learning and APIs to help you prevent the fraud and compliance challenges that people have. And so, to date, over 1 billion transactions and supporting 200 different companies. So countries, obviously, if you're talking about fraud prevention and onboarding and identity verification, there's different types of documents and proof, in addition to just doing selfies, being able to scan passports or driver's licenses or other national identity cards. And you can just imagine how many different types there are for all the different countries and states within countries. And so being able to do that analysis and data extraction from all these different sources is obviously a pretty challenging, complex task. We've actually hit last year a milestone, which was over $200 million in bookings. And while the company is headquartered in Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, the company is also a global company with engineering offices around the world, Vienna, Bangalore, Montreal, and a good chunk of distributed workforce. So I actually am joining you from Seattle. Even though I've spent most of my life in California, I moved to Seattle a little over a year ago. Some people call me crazy, but I'm enjoying it so far. So just moving on now to why we're here and why did Jumio go to DataHub. So we have a lot of challenges at Jumio. The machine learning stuff that we've done is actually relatively new. Given the overall history of Jumio of around 10 years, the machine learning aspects have only been around for about 4 years or so, predates me, but it was sort of an add-on, if you will, and not just related to machine learning, but there's a lot of productivity challenges, just data discovery, access to the data, understanding the data, typical data challenges that companies have, and combining that with the global data and workforce, as I mentioned, all the different data sources, the different countries, and having the distributed nature of our teams where the people doing machine learning are in North America and Europe and in India. And so that poses additional challenges when you combine that with legal and regulatory challenges of where you can have the data, GDPR kind of concerns, and not just obviously GDPR, but there's plenty of other regulations and laws coming up around the world, including CCPA in California and BIPA coming out of Illinois, and having to deal with all these different legal and regulatory challenges as part of our data management has also been a challenge. And from a productivity perspective, some of the consequences of that have to do with duplicated work, because teams, these distributed teams don't have the discovery and access that we're hoping that they would be able to have. There's a lot of duplication, people doing the same, say, feature calculations or data set generation that obviously would or could be resolved if we had a way to make this information much more available. And as I mentioned, the compliance aspect is also a big challenge there as well. So, what we've got today in our current pre-DataHub setup is we're an AWS shop, and we have data centers in we use 3 different regions within AWS, the US, EU, and Singapore region. And our homegrown data set management tool and user interface that's built on Athena, and our data is primarily in S3. As I mentioned, with doing identity verification and things like that, there's a lot of images, a lot of image and video data that we have. And so all of that's stored in S3, for example. So on top of the homegrown service, we don't have any kind of single sign-on related to that. And along with that, very basic role-based access control. The search is pretty simplistic. We don't have something like an Elasticsearch or similar search engine. It's just sort of your typical database queries. And the metadata is also just limited to data sets. So you can search for data sets, but there's no other kind of data, whether that's models or model features, jobs, all of the other kinds of metadata, and obviously none of the related linking that you might be able to get. And on top of that, essentially no governance other than, who can log in and work with the data sets. So what did we do? Well, obviously we started this effort to address this as part of a larger data initiative that I launched in, it's probably a year and a half ago now, more broadly than just, hey, we need a data catalog. It was more of an overall strategic initiative, including data mesh. But within the data mesh idea, you have discovery, and discovery was one of the things that was a big gap. So we started looking around at different open source and commercial products, and we had a bunch of different factors that we were looking at. And of course, then what did we do? We ended up picking DataHub. So you also see Acrodata on the bottom there. We, as I'll mention in a little bit, we did actually look at the managed DataHub as well. So yes, DataHub was our choice. And so how did we ended up doing that? We have decided for the time being to use the open source DataHub and deploy it ourselves. One of the choices that we made was to use the out-of-box Helm charts without any modifications. This had a couple consequences, one of which is we are using EKS, even though a lot of our other services are, or most of our services actually now in production are using ECS. But we do have some Kubernetes use cases or usage in Jumio. And given that the DataHub deployment was already all working with EKS, we didn't want to take the additional effort to go and try and figure out how to get this working with ECS. It might have been easy, but we didn't want to go and give that a try, given the staffing and resources and time that we were trying to do. And we also wanted to do serverless, so we chose EKS Fargate. This had some interesting knock-on consequences for us. So we used Datadog for logging with the out-of-box Helm charts without changing them. We couldn't add Datadog Sidecar, for example. So we ended up looking at and using a thing called kubemod, which allows you to sort of more dynamically do some deployment of in this case, sidecars, which is what we did. So we could continue to use the out-of-box Helm charts. And as I mentioned, one of the big things that we didn't have in our prior solution was single sign-on. Jumio uses Okta for its single sign-on service, and we've integrated DataHub with our corporate Okta. This is all deployed in the E region. This is something that Jumio has done in general for most of its data related stuff, is that we, for sort of as an easy way to deal with data locality requirements, we just keep everything or move everything into the EU if it's not generated there. But all of the existing stuff in the other regions in the US and Singapore, what we wanted to do obviously is have a single repository for everybody to do discovery, as opposed to the current situation where if somebody wanted to find the data set, they would have to log in. If they didn't know which region their data set was in, they would have to log into potentially 3 different locations to find their data set. Or if they needed data from all regions, they would have to go to every region. So what we've done is that existing metadata service publishes to SNS, and we're listening to that from an SQSQ in the EU, gathering all of that metadata. And because the metadata is obviously our own format in our existing service, we built what we're calling an adapter service, which basically is a Spring Boot application running in the EU in EKS that takes the metadata and transforms it into the DataHub format using the Java client and pushes that into DataHub. And so that is how we've deployed it. And while it's not quite in production yet, we're in the final stages of testing, and everything is syncing correctly. And basically, we just have to do our final bit of testing and backfilling of all of the existing data sets that are out there in the other regions. And then we'll be actually deploying it to all of Jumio. So speaking of deployment then and adoption, we are intending to open it up to all of Jumio. We've had a lot of situations, and I've been in meetings where people have asked, well, what's, this particular field or data about? And I would have side conversations with colleagues on Slack, like, well, if we had our data catalog, if we had our discovery service deployed, this product manager or the support person wouldn't need to ask that question. They could just go and find out for themselves. But our initial target users are the data scientists and ML engineers within Jumio, because we are initially just deploying to get the data set information into DataHub. because again, that's the only metadata management that we have. But we have a lot of tools, as I was alluding to earlier, diverse tool chains. We use things like Databricks and Airflow and SageMaker, and getting all of that data into DataHub is where we're going. So some of the enhancements that we're looking for is actually exactly what Shashank was mentioning earlier around schemas. And that was key for us because we have some use cases where we're interested in the schema and not so much about the data sets. And so, for example, we have, as part of that KYX platform that I was mentioning, there's a rule engine, and a typical business rule engine, if some of you might be familiar, they have data models that need to be defined. A fact model, facts are the lingo for the rule engine in terms of the data. So these fact models are backed by schemas today. They're actually JSON schemas, and the team that is using those is just sort of built their own little storage mechanism in S3 to load these schemas. But obviously, it would be nice if they could put those into this common service that we're deploying, built on DataHub, and being able to just save and retrieve these schemas to be able to have the rule engine, for example, know what the data is that's coming in. So having the schemas as a first-class entity is going to be great, and the schema registry support, where we can then also leverage that with other services that know about Confluent Schema Registry. That'll be another great thing. One thing that recently came up as we were deploying is roles associated with groups. I submitted a feature request for that just recently, actually. It's not a showstopper, but it would certainly help us in terms of managing the security model. So the final thing too that we were looking for, I mentioned at the beginning that the initiative started out as far as looking for metadata service was around data mesh. And so I had started a discussion around DataHub supporting this notion of data products. And actually, Maggie went in and created this Slack channel, and there's been some good discussion on that, and that's an ongoing discussion. It's going to be interesting to see where that goes. But for Jumio, that's still a roadmap item. It's sort of slow rolled due to a variety of situations, but where are we going from here? So as I said, we need that schema repository. The data that we have is relatively poor around schemas. It hasn't been a focus at Jumio for a variety of reasons. And so just getting people to create schemas and have that documentation and field level metadata, being able to specify things as PII, and having that strongly typed information. While we have the data sets today, the schema metadata information that we have doesn't include documentation, or certainly not field level documentation. We do know which fields are PII, but we don't have things like, is this biometric data versus, just address data or something like that. So just the expanding on schemas is really what the focus is going to be at Jumio and the use of DataHub in the near term. But then obviously starting to integrate other metadata is the other top priority. As I mentioned, we're using SageMaker and Airflow and Databricks and several other tools, Colina for model testing. So that last bullet about data and analytics test automation, it's one thing, on the data side and integration with things like Great Expectations. But on the model testing side, there are tools out there, as I mentioned, like Colino, which is one of the tools that we're using. Getting all of that metadata with the lineage and governance around that is going to be key. And finally, hopefully, we'll be able to actually switch to manage DataHub from Acro and not have to deal with all of this metadata, all of this infrastructure ourselves. We did do a POC with Acro last fall, and everything went well. It was more of a business level issue that kicked that can down the road, and we had been doing a parallel effort to stand up the infrastructure at the same time, just in case the can was kicked down the road as it happened. And so one of the things that I'm still looking for is ultimately to switch to the managed DataHub down the road. And so that's really all I had, given trying to keep within a time frame here. And so here's some contact information if you want to reach out. I'm happy to discuss any of this, obviously on the DataHub Slack, but feel free to reach out with anything else. Thanks a lot.